Frank Thomas, aka the Big Hurt, was one of the 1990s finest ball players. He seemed to have no limitations. He hit for average, power, and was patient, walking more than he struck out for his career. His consistency is underappreciated, and there's a stat we'll discuss later on that all but confirms this claim. He played 16 years with the White Sox and set record after record for the franchise. He made a baseball bat look like a toothpick and was one of the most imposing and dangerous hitters throughout his 19-year big league career. It's about time we got around to this video. Frank Thomas has been a player on my list for a while now, and so many of you have been requesting him. Thank you to everyone for the suggestions, and make sure to leave a comment and maybe you'll be featured on a future video. As always, if you enjoy, make sure to leave a like and consider subscribing. Hit the bell to enable all notifications so you don't miss any future Cam23 videos. Frank Edward Thomas Jr. was born on May 27, 1968 in Columbus, Georgia to parents Frank and Charlie May. Frank Sr. was a bail bondsman and Charlie May was a textile worker. Frank Jr. was the fifth of 6 children, and with being one of the youngest siblings came a lot of attention and affection. The tight-knit family had 2 parents that cared a great deal, setting proper boundaries that some might view as being strict. Much of Frank's free time was spent playing sports, including baseball, football, and basketball. Growing up, Frank played with children much older than himself. At just 9 years old, he played in the Pop Warner League that was geared toward 12-year-olds. His dream to be a professional ball player grew as time went on. Frank was a Little League baseball player, but was already striking fear into opposing pitchers. He was an imposing presence, towering over the other kids. Combine that with a frightening level of ability, and pitchers were scared to throw the ball over the plate. He would be no stranger to the walk. The soon-to-be 6'5", 240-pound hitter caught a glimpse of his future in baseball. In 1977, the Thomas family was faced with tragedy when Frank Jr.'s 2-year-old sister Pamela died of leukemia. The devastating loss would be a primary reason for Frank Jr. eventually involving himself with the Leukemia Foundation, helping to raise money for research into a cure for the disease. It was reported in 1996 that he was donating up to $50,000 a year. Throughout his time at Columbus High School, Frank Thomas excelled in baseball, but his talent within basketball and football shouldn't be underestimated. As a sophomore, he hit cleanup for a baseball team that won a state championship. As a senior, he batted .440, was a forward on the basketball team, and was named an all-state tight end in football. After graduating from high school, the 1986 amateur draft appeared to be Frank's ticket to professional baseball. 891 players were signed following this draft, and surprisingly, Frank was not one of them. He was shocked and upset, but decided to accept a football scholarship at Auburn University. An eventual injury almost cost him his scholarship, since it was contingent on him playing for the football team. But instead, the school continued his funding. He quickly proved himself to the baseball coach and joined the team. He eventually shifted his focus entirely to baseball and would shatter numerous school records. In just 3 years, he was the all-time leader in 6 major offensive categories. In 1988, Frank was hopeful of being selected to the Summer Olympics team, but would not make the final squad. His days of being overlooked would soon come to an end. 1 year later, in 1989, the Chicago White Sox drafted Frank Thomas 7th overall in the first round of the amateur draft. He needed just 181 games in the minors to prove he was major league ready. His major league debut came on August 2nd in 1990, where he picked up his first RBI in the big leagues. His first home run came on August 28th against the Twins in Minnesota. Frank played in 60 games total in his first year at the game's highest level, and he made a statement. A .330 batting average and a .177 OPS plus are all you need to hear to know that he was ready for the bright lights and the game's biggest stage. Early on in his career, he earned the nickname Big Hurt, quipped by legendary broadcaster Ken the Hawk Harrelson.
You can put it on the board! Yes!
The nickname became synonymous with Frank. It refers to his towering presence and ability to inflict damage on opposing pitchers. Frank played first base for about half of his career. While his fielding wasn't great, he more than made up for it at the plate. Over time, he would slowly transition into an everyday role as the team's designated hitter. 1991 kicked off a string of dominance that lasted the entirety of the 90s for Frank the Tank. What was his secret? He was a complete hitter, meaning he could hit for power, average, and he drew a lot of walks. Frank showcased this during his first full season and was very much in the MVP conversation. Even with a strong first half, he didn't make the All-Star team, but at season's end proved himself worthy of a third-place finish in MVP voting, behind Cecil fielder and Cal Ripken Jr., who won the award. Frank would also pick up his first career Silver Slugger. Let's dig into the numbers. First off, putting together a 7-WAR season as a player with such little Major League experience is outstanding. Frank led the league in walks, on-base percentage, OPS, and OPS+. His .453 on-base percentage was nearly 30 points higher than second-place Willie Randolph, and his 138 walks were 30 more than the next closest player, Brett Butler. Frank's 109 RBIs in '91 started a string of 8 consecutive seasons with 100 or more. Thomas was tied for 7th in home runs amongst all big league players. While he would never lead the league in home runs or RBIs, Frank would post consistently great power numbers and bat north of 300 throughout the 90s. Prior to the 1992 season, Thomas received a new 3-year, $4.5 million contract, plus performance bonuses. He also married his first wife, Elise Silver. Not too shabby of an offseason. The season that followed was incredibly similar to his '91 campaign. He led the league in walks, on-base percentage, OPS, and doubles with 46. His home runs went down, but his overall production didn't. In fact, his 7-WAR is identical to the year prior, and led the league in offensive WAR. The MVP voting was a bit wacky in '92, as Dennis Eckersley took home the award, and the Big Hurt finished 8th. I'm sorry, but several players including Mike Devereaux and Joe Carter finishing above Frank is wild. Hindsight is 2020, and the emphasis on different stats made for some interesting outcomes. If you saw my Kirby Puckett video, you would know that he deserves to be up there in the top 3, but in my book, Frank is right there with him. Frank was an offensive juggernaut in 1993. He made his first All-Star team and hit 41 homers with 128 RBIs, a .317 batting average, an OPS north of 1,000, a .177 OPS plus, and more than double the number of walks to strikeouts. The voters unanimously decided on Frank Thomas and awarded him his first career MVP. Inevitably, he won his second Silver Slugger award. After helping the White Sox to an AL West division crown, Frank got his first taste of October baseball. His performance did not disappoint. A .353 batting average, a home run, 3 RBIs, and 10 walks in 6 games is fantastic, but the White Sox lost a tough series against the Toronto Blue Jays in the first round. The 1994 player strike cut the season short, but Frank Thomas in 40 fewer games put together some video game numbers. For a stat nerd such as myself, digesting 94 Frank Thomas's season is like a kid in a candy store. Let's start with the power numbers. 38 homers and 101 RBIs is ridiculous. In his previous 3 seasons, he played in an average of 157 games. Had he played that number of games in 1994, he was on pace to hit 52 homers and drive in 140. He batted a career-high .353, and his triple slash numbers led the league and are incomprehensible. He was approaching a .500 on-base percentage. That's Barry Bonds territory, and he wasn't intentionally walked nearly as often. Last video, I mentioned Mike Schmidt had a .198 OPS plus in his 1981 MVP season. Frank Thomas played 11 more games and put up a .212 OPS plus. Frank was 112% better than the league average hitter in 1994. For good measure, he led the league in walks, offensive WAR, and took home back-to-back MVP awards. He made his second All-Star team and secured his third Silver Slugger. The real kicker is that the White Sox, prior to the cancellation of the playoffs, were a serious contender. After the league reworked the divisions, the White Sox were atop the newly formed Central Division. It's a shame because Frank wouldn't get many opportunities in the postseason, and while they weren't seen as World Series favorites, you never know what the end result could have been. Following the '94 season, the White Sox signed Thomas to a new 4-year contract that paid him an average of $7.25 million a year. Additionally, he would receive endorsement deals from several companies, including Reebok, Pepsi-Cola, and Bausch & Lomb. Frank Thomas always remained humble, even when the spotlight shined the brightest. The fame, money, and attention never dimmed his competitive spirit. He said it best, "I can't afford not showing up at the ballpark mentally. I have to be on every night to be a force in the lineup." And that he did. Before we look at his 1995 season, I'll mention that Frank edged out Albert Bell to claim the Home Run Derby title. And during the 1995 All-Star Game, Frank Thomas launched a rocket down the line to hit the first ever White Sox home run in an All-Star Game. This year would go on to be his second 40-homer season, and Thomas led the league in games played, walks, sacrifice flies, and intentional walks. This was his 4th season to have an OPS above 1,000, and he finished 8th in MVP voting. Meanwhile, the White Sox team wouldn't be competitive until the turn of the century. They consistently finished 2nd in the division, and regularly hovered around .500 baseball. Frank's consistency throughout this time frame is remarkable. In 1996, he reached 40 home runs for the third time of his career, drove in 134 runs, and batted .349, the highest mark for a full 162. He made his fourth All-Star team and again finished 8th in MVP voting. He did this despite missing time with a stress fracture in his left foot. In 1997, like clockwork, Frank once again exceeded a 1,000 OPS, his 5th consecutive season to do so. For the first time in his career, Thomas won the batting title, hitting .347, a comfortable 17-point lead over second place Edgar Martinez. Frank also led the league in on-base percentage, OPS, and OPS+. He finished 3rd in MVP voting behind Tino Martinez and Ken Griffey Jr., who won the award. No shame in losing to the kid, who hit 12 more homers than second place Tino Martinez. 97 would also be the last year that Frank Thomas played more at first base than as a designated hitter. Frank Thomas was in the middle of his career, yet would never make another All-Star team following 1997. Don't ask me how, but the Big Hurt was nowhere near finished with his impressive baseball career. I have to share this crazy stat. From 1991 to 1997, Frank Thomas was top 10 in the MVP race every year. But even more impressive, he became the first player in history to put together 7 consecutive seasons where he hit over 300 with 20 or more home runs, 100 RBIs, 100 runs, and 100 walks. Only a few players have come close to his record, with Lou Gehrig, Ted Williams, and Jason Giambi each accomplishing the feat as many as 4 times. The 2 seasons that followed this stretch were not up to Frank's sky-high standards, but let's look at it this way. He was still on par with what Adley, Rutschman, and Nolan Arenado have done offensively in 2023, according to OPS+. That's still really good. During this time, his marriage with his wife Elise was falling apart. The off-field issues for Frank were affecting his on-field performance. In one game early on in the season, there were back-to-back questionable pitches called strikes. He blew it out of proportion when he protested the calls publicly. When the umpires caught wind, they started to call strikes on inside pitches more frequently on him. Having to adjust to a new strike zone didn't stop Frank from capping off his streak of 8 consecutive 100 RBI seasons. His batting average, however, dipped well below 300 for the first time of his big league career. 1999 saw Frank playing 25 games less than his 98th season thanks to a season-ending injury on an injured right ankle. The offseason that followed was a brutal one for Thomas. His agent and one of his best friends, Robert Fraley, was killed in a plane crash that also took the life of Payne Stewart, one of the best golfers of his generation. Frank was in shock when he heard the news, and it was extremely difficult for him to accept the unfortunate reality. The following spring training, Frank's father was gravely ill with kidney failure and heart problems. Frank flew home to Georgia to be with him. The health scare hit him pretty hard, and he came to the realization that, quote, "We're all on borrowed time." 2000 saw Frank Thomas return to his dominant self, putting up career highs in hits, home runs, RBIs, and total bases. 43 bombs, 143 runs driven in, and a .328 average merited his 4th Silver Slugger award. Somehow, someway, Frank was snubbed from making the All-Star team in one of his finest seasons. In MVP voting, Jason Giambi narrowly won the award over Thomas. The year 2000 saw the White Sox return to the playoffs after a 6-season hiatus. Thomas had a rough series, going 0 for 9 as the White Sox were swept by the Seattle Mariners. The lowest point of Frank Thomas's career came in 2001. His father tragically passed away, and Frank would soon undergo season-ending surgery on his right arm, having played in just 20 games for the year. He described both events as the worst week of his life. The tough breaks didn't stop there. After several years of separation, the divorce between Frank and his wife Elise was finalized. In 2002, Frank bounced back and was modestly productive on offense. He was striking out more than ever, but he still had reasonably good power numbers. 2003 was a resurgent season. He reached the 40-homer mark for the 5th and final time of his career. He drove in over 100 and finished in the top 15 for MVP voting. 2004 and 2005 were statistically great for Frank when he was on the field. His batting averages might not suggest it, but he was 56% and 31% better than league average respectively, according to OPS+. He battled foot fractures in both seasons, with the second time coming in the midst of a memorable year for the Chicago White Sox fan base, as the team won their first World Series championship in 88 years. It was unfortunate timing for Frank Thomas, as he was not a part of the World Series roster, but he would still receive a ring. This would be the last of Frank Thomas in a White Sox uniform. He finished his decade-and-a-half-long White Sox career as the team's all-time leader in home runs, RBIs, doubles, walks, and runs. Before we discuss the Frank Thomas versus the White Sox fiasco, in November of 2005, he married his second wife, Megan, and the two are still married today. He had a son and 2 daughters from his first marriage, and together they have 6 children. Some drama took place before the 2006 regular season. The White Sox re-signed Paul Konerko and traded for Thome, sending the message that the team was moving in a different direction. The White Sox chairman, Jerry Reinsdorf, didn't call Frank Thomas to let him know he wasn't coming back. After 16 years with the team, he was hurt that he was treated as a passing-by player. To add fuel to the fire, the general manager, Ken Williams, wasn't a fan of Frank Thomas. He made some ruthless comments to the media. Speaking on behalf of the whole team, he would say that they won't miss him, good riddance, and for Frank Thomas to stay out of the White Sox business. Billy Beane, general manager of the Athletics, was impressed after talking with Thomas during the winter meetings. There was a real sense of determination in talking to him. Arguably, he is one of the greatest offensive players of his generation. Eventually, Frank found a new home with the Oakland Athletics and responded to the comments with a performance on the field that can be summed up with the famous Michael Jordan meme. And I took that personally. The Big Hurt received a warm welcome when he returned to Chicago and promptly hit 2 home runs in his first game back. Thomas had a renaissance with the A's after 2 injury-riddled seasons that saw him play a combined 108 games. He nearly reached 40 homers and easily surpassed 100 RBIs. In MVP voting, he finished 4th, his highest finish since the year 2000. He reached the postseason for the final time of his career with Oakland and had a monster division series against the Minnesota Twins, going 5 for 10 with 2 home runs, both occurring in Game 1. The championship series wasn't quite the same, as he failed to get a hit in 13 at-bats facing the Detroit Tigers. The A's ultimately were swept in 4 straight. 2007 saw Frank on the move again, this time signing a 2-year, $18 million deal with the Toronto Blue Jays. During this season, he reached the 500 home run milestone. Overall, he put up pretty good numbers in 2007, nearly reaching 100 RBIs and hitting 26 homers. But Frank was 39 years old now, and his days in the big leagues were numbered. On April 20th, 2008, Frank Thomas was released by the Blue Jays. 4 days later, he and the Athletics reunited, and he would finish off what would become his final big league season. After sitting out the 2009 season, Frank Thomas announced his retirement from baseball. The White Sox retired his number 35 in 2010. For his career, Frank Thomas posted a 73.8 WAR, batted .301, belted 521 home runs, drove in 1,704 runs, and posted a 156 OPS+. A 2-time MVP winner, 4-time Silver Slugger, and won the batting title in 1997. In 2011, Frank Thomas started his own beer company called Big Hurt Beer after his iconic nickname. The Hall of Fame case for players who spent a decent portion of their careers as a designated hitter can be complicated. It wasn't for Frank Thomas. In 2014, he was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame alongside Greg Maddux and Tom Glavine. What a prestigious group of ballplayers to all get elected at the same time. That same year, Thomas joined Fox Sports as a studio analyst for MLB on Fox. In April of 2023, Fox Sports replaced him with Derek Jeter. Shortly thereafter, Thomas joined Apple TV's Friday Night Baseball coverage. He can occasionally be seen interviewing and serving as a color commentator. In 2022, Frank Thomas established the charity Field of Big Dreams. Their mission is to aid children dealing with cancer treatment along with supporting the mental and physical well-being of our veterans and their families. If you want to learn more about his charity, I'll include the link in the description of this video. Frank Thomas is one of the greatest sluggers of his generation, but the Big Hurt is also one of the most underappreciated. He didn't just mash homers, he was a complete hitter. He hit for average, power, and walked more than he struck out. His prime started the moment he reached the big leagues. Frank was faced with many challenges during the heart of his career, and the way he was able to overcome that adversity is admirable. In his prime, Frank Thomas was one of the most terrifying hitters to face. Let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on the video. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like and consider subscribing. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.